The stars above the Sinai wilderness burned with a clarity that only desert skies can produce. Thousands upon thousands of points of light scattered across the heavens, forming patterns that the ancient Egyptians had named after their gods, and the Hebrews were learning to see differently, as the handiwork of the one who had led them out of bondage, this silent testimony of a creator whose power had humbled Pharaoh and parted the sea. Beneath this canopy of celestial fire spread across the rocky plain at the foot of a smoking mountain, the nation of Israel slept in their tents, restless with memories they could not forget, and dreams they could not yet fully imagine. 3 months had passed since the night of blood and deliverance, since the angel of death had swept through Egypt claiming the firstborn of every household, not marked by the crimson sign of sacrifice. 3 months since they had walked out of the only home most of them had ever known, carrying whatever they could salvage from 400 years of slavery. Gold and silver pressed upon them by terrified Egyptian neighbours, unleavened bread wrapped hastily in kneading bowls, children hoisted onto shoulders and elderly relatives supported on trembling arms. 3 months since the sea had opened before them like a wound in the world itself, walls of water standing sentinel while they crossed on dry ground, then collapsing in thunder and chaos upon the pursuing chariots of the most powerful army on earth. They were free. That much was certain, though the meaning of freedom remained elusive to a people whose grandparents' grandparents had been born in chains. Egypt had shaped them in ways they were only beginning to understand, not just their bodies, broken by generations of forced labour, but their minds, conditioned to think of themselves as property rather than persons, as objects to be used rather than souls bearing the image of God. The whips that had driven them to make bricks without straw had left scars that went deeper than skin. The taskmasters who had counted their quotas and punished their failures had planted voices in their heads that still whispered accusations in moments of doubt and difficulty. And there had been many such moments in these 3 months of wandering. The initial euphoria of escape had given way to the grinding realities of wilderness existence. Water had been scarce, then bitter, then miraculously sweetened. Food had run out, prompting complaints that Moses had led them into the desert to starve. Better the meat pots of Egypt, they grumbled, than this slow death beneath an indifferent sky. They had faced enemies who attacked without provocation, diseases that threatened to sweep through the crowded encampments, internal conflicts that tested the fragile unity of a people who had never before had to govern themselves. Yet through it all, they had not been alone. The God who had heard their groaning in Egypt, who had remembered his covenant with Abraham, and Isaac and Jacob, who had revealed himself to Moses in the flames of a bush that burned without being consumed, this God had accompanied them every step of their journey. By day, a pillar of cloud rose above the camp, a visible sign of divine presence that guided their movements and shielded them from the merciless desert sun. By night, that same pillar transformed into fire, a beacon of warmth and protection that held the darkness at bay and reminded them that they were not wandering aimlessly but being led toward a destination their guide had already chosen. And there was the manna. Each morning, as the dew lifted from the desert floor, they found it waiting for them. Thin flakes like frost, white as coriander seed, tasting of honey and fresh bread. "What is it?" they had asked when they first saw it, the Hebrew words manhu giving the substance its name. What is it? This food that appears from nowhere, that must be gathered fresh each day, that spoils if hoarded overnight yet miraculously remains fresh through the Sabbath. The manna taught them lessons they had never learned in Egypt, lessons about trust and dependence, about receiving rather than grasping, about a God who provided enough for today and asked them to believe he would do the same tomorrow. Now, they were camped at Sinai, the mountain where Moses had first encountered the God of their fathers in the burning bush, the place where he had removed his sandals on ground that was suddenly, inexplicably holy. The mountain itself rose above them like a warning and a promise, its peaks hidden in clouds that flickered with internal lightning, its slopes trembling with the weight of a presence that made even the rocks afraid. They had heard the thunder that was not thunder, the voice that spoke from the fire with words that etched themselves into stone and soul alike. They had received the commandments, 10 words that would define their relationship with God and with each other, 10 boundaries that were not restrictions but protections, the architecture of a freedom they were still learning to inhabit, But the commandments were only the beginning. Moses had climbed the mountain again, disappearing into the cloud that covered its summit, remaining in the presence of God for 40 days and 40 nights, while the people waited below in increasing anxiety. What was he receiving up there, in that terrible and wonderful meeting place between heaven and earth? What instructions, what revelations, what blueprints for the life this newborn nation was meant to live? The answer was more comprehensive than they could have imagined. God was giving Moses detailed plans for something unprecedented in human religious experience, a dwelling place, a tent of meeting, a structure of fabric and wood and precious metal that would serve as the visible center of divine presence in the midst of the Israelite camp. The Egyptians had built temples of stone that reached toward the sky, monuments to gods they housed and controlled. The Canaanites had their high places and sacred groves, their altars scattered across the landscape wherever human hands had erected them. But this would be different. This would be a portable sanctuary, a movable holy place that could accompany the people through their wanderings, a tent that would somehow contain the uncontainable, housing the glory of the God who filled heaven and earth within walls of embroidered linen and boards of acacia wood. They would call it the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, from a Hebrew root meaning to dwell or to settle. The name itself carried profound theological weight. The God of Israel was not distant or indifferent, not confined to a single sacred mountain, or accessible only through special pilgrimages to remote locations. He was choosing to dwell among his people, to make his home in their midst, to travel with them through the wilderness and eventually into the land of promise. The cloud and fire that had guided them would settle over this tent, marking it as the place where heaven touched earth, where the holy intersected with the human, where a sinful people could somehow approach a righteous God. The instructions Moses received on the mountain were elaborate in their detail. The tabernacle would be constructed in layers of increasing holiness, like a series of protective barriers surrounding a nuclear core of divine presence. The outermost boundary would be a courtyard, enclosed by linen curtains hung from bronze pillars, creating a defined sacred space within the larger camp. Inside this courtyard, closer to the central tent, would be a bronze basin for priestly washing, a place of cleansing before service. The tent itself would be divided into two chambers: the holy place, where priests would minister daily among lampstands and tables and altars of incense, and the Holy of Holies, the innermost sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant would rest, beneath the overshadowing wings of golden cherubim, the very throne of God's presence among his people. But before anyone could pass through those linen curtains, before any priest could wash at the bronze basin, before any worshipper could approach the inner mysteries of the tent itself, they would encounter something else. Standing in the eastern entrance of the courtyard, impossible to ignore or circumvent, would be the altar. The bronze altar. The altar of burnt offering. The place where fire burned perpetually, where blood was poured out daily, where the fundamental transaction of biblical worship, life given in place of life, was enacted again and again in an endless rhythm of sacrifice and smoke. This altar would become the most frequently used object in the entire tabernacle complex. The Ark of the Covenant, for all its supreme holiness, was hidden behind multiple curtains, accessible only once a year to the high priest alone. The golden lampstand cast its light in chambers that ordinary Israelites would never see. But the bronze altar stood in the open courtyard, visible to anyone who entered, available to anyone who came with an offering, perpetually active as a stream of worshippers brought their lambs and bulls and goats to the priests who tended its flames. The placement was not accidental. Nothing in the tabernacle was accidental. Every detail had been revealed by God to Moses on the mountain, every measurement and material specified with a precision that indicated profound meaning beneath the physical descriptions. The altar stood at the entrance because the altar represented the non-negotiable starting point of any relationship with the holy. Before communion came atonement. Before intimacy came cleansing. Before anyone could approach the dwelling place of God, they had to pass through fire. The theology embedded in this arrangement would take generations to fully understand, and even then, its deepest meanings would await a fulfillment that lay centuries in the future. But even in those earliest days, gathered beneath the stars at Sinai, the newly freed slaves of Egypt understood something essential about what the altar represented. They had seen blood on their doorposts in Egypt, had watched death pass over the households marked by sacrifice, while it struck down the unmarked with terrible precision. They knew that something had to die so that they could live. They knew that freedom had been purchased at a cost, that their deliverance had required a lamb, that the God who saved them was also the God who demanded something in return. Not because he was capricious or bloodthirsty. The surrounding nations had gods like that, deities who demanded endless offerings to appease their volatile moods. The God of Israel was different. The sacrifice he required was not about feeding his hunger or calming his wrath through bribery. It was about acknowledging the true nature of things, that sin had consequences, that broken covenant created debt, that the gap between human failure and divine holiness could not be bridged by good intentions alone. Something had to bridge it. Something innocent had to stand in the place of the guilty. Something had to burn so that others could be spared the burning. These truths were still forming in the consciousness of the people camped beneath the mountain, still taking shape in minds that had been so recently liberated from Egyptian ways of thinking. They did not yet have the vocabulary to articulate the full theology of atonement that later generations would develop. They only knew that when Moses came down from the mountain with the plans for the tabernacle, the altar featured prominently among them. They knew that this place of fire would stand at the centre of their communal life, that its flames would burn day and night, that their relationship with the God who had saved them would be mediated through the smoke and blood and heat of perpetual sacrifice. The construction had not yet begun. Moses was still on the mountain, still, receiving the detailed instructions that would guide the craftsmen in their work. The people below were still waiting, still wondering, still adjusting to the strange new reality of freedom and covenant, and a God who chose to dwell among them, rather than merely watch them from afar. But the altar was coming. The fire was being prepared, and when at last it was kindled, when the first offering burned, and the smoke rose toward heaven, and the presence of God descended to meet his people at the place of sacrifice, everything would change. The nation that had walked through the divided sea would learn to walk through fire as well, not the fire of destruction, but the fire of purification, not the flames of judgment, but the flames of grace. They would learn that the God who had brought them out of Egypt was also the God who would bring them into his presence, one sacrifice at a time, one surrender at a time, one encounter with holy fire at a time. The stars continued their slow wheel overhead. The mountain continued to smoke and tremble. The people continued to sleep and dream and wonder what tomorrow would bring. And somewhere in the divine imagination, the bronze was already beginning to gleam, the acacia wood was already being shaped, and the fire that would burn without ceasing was already kindling in the heart of God. The altar was almost ready. Israel was about to learn what it meant to worship. When Moses descended from Mount Sinai after 40 days in the presence of God, he carried with him more than his stone tablets inscribed with divine commandments. He carried detailed instructions for every aspect of the tabernacle's construction, measurements and materials, colours and configurations, a comprehensive blueprint that left nothing to human improvisation. The God who had spoken the universe into existence with a word had chosen to communicate with painstaking specificity about the dwelling place his people would build for him. Every cubit mattered. Every fabric had significance. Every element, from the golden cherubim atop the ark to the bronze pins that would anchor the courtyard curtains, had been revealed with intentional precision. But blueprints, however divine their origin, require human hands to translate them into physical reality. The former slaves gathered at Sinai possessed many skills. They had built entire cities for Pharaoh, after all, had mixed mortar and laid bricks under the relentless Egyptian sun. But the tabernacle would demand artistry of a different order. This was not the brutal labour of construction gangs driven by whips and quotas. This was sacred craftsmanship, work that required not merely technical competence, but spiritual sensitivity, the ability to translate divine vision into material form without diminishing the holiness of what was being created. God had anticipated this need, and his provision came in the form of two men whose names would be remembered as long as the story of the tabernacle was told. Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, from the tribe of Judah, was the first. The text says that God filled him with the same Spirit that had hovered over the waters at creation, the same divine breath that had animated Adam's clay, now empowering a craftsman for sacred work. This filling brought with it wisdom, understanding, and knowledge in every kind of craft, working with gold, silver, and bronze, cutting and setting precious stones, carving wood, designing artistic patterns. Bezalel was not merely talented, he was anointed, his abilities supernaturally enhanced for the specific task of building a house for God. Alongside him stood Aholiab, son of Ahisamach, from the tribe of Dan. Where Bezalel came from the preeminent tribe of Judah, the line from which kings would eventually emerge, Aholiab came from a tribe of lesser status, a reminder that God's gifting transcended human hierarchies. He too was filled with skill in engraving, embroidering, weaving the blue, purple, and scarlet yarns that would colour the tabernacle's fabrics. Together, these two men would oversee the entire construction project, training others in the necessary crafts, ensuring that every element matched the pattern Moses had received on the mountain. The people themselves became participants in the work through their offerings. Moses had called for contributions: gold, silver, bronze, yarn, linen, animal skins, acacia wood, oil, spices, precious stones, and the response had been overwhelming. Day after day, Israelites brought their treasures to the craftsmen, jewellery they had carried out of Egypt, materials they had acquired in ways the text does not explain, personal possessions surrendered for a purpose that exceeded private ownership. The offerings came so abundantly that Moses eventually had to issue a restraining order, commanding the people to stop bringing because they had more than enough for every aspect of the work. There was something healing in this collective generosity. These former slaves, who had owned nothing under Pharaoh's rule, who had been property themselves rather than possessors of property, now discovered the profound satisfaction of giving from what they had to something larger than themselves. The tabernacle would belong to all of them precisely because all of them had contributed to its creation. The gold that would overlay the ark came from their hands. The bronze that would plate the altar came from their offerings. They were building something together, and the building itself was forming them into the kind of community that could carry the presence of God. Among all the elements that Bezalel and his workers would construct, the bronze altar held a particular significance that its placement at the entrance of the courtyard underscored. This would be the largest object in the entire complex, 7.5 feet square, 4.5 feet high, impossible to miss or minimize. Its sheer size made a statement. Whatever this altar represented was not peripheral to Israel's worship but central to it, not an optional accessory, but an unavoidable necessity. The construction began with acacia wood, the desert tree that grew in the wadas and valleys of the Sinai Peninsula. Acacia was remarkable material, hard, dense, resistant to decay and insects, capable of lasting for generations without rotting even in harsh conditions. The Hebrew word for acacia, shittim, appeared repeatedly in the tabernacle instructions. It was the wood of choice for nearly every structural element, from the frames of the tent itself to the poles that would carry the ark in transit. There was something appropriate about building God's dwelling place from trees that had learned to survive in the wilderness, that had put down roots in hostile soil and flourished where other species failed. The craftsman shaped the acacia into a hollow box, 4 walls forming a square, open at the top and bottom. This hollow construction served practical purposes. A solid block of wood that size would have been impossibly heavy to transport, and the tabernacle was designed to be mobile, dismantled and reassembled at each stage of Israel's wilderness journey. But the hollowness also allowed for the grating that would be installed inside, a bronze network positioned partway down the interior where the fire would burn and the sacrifices would rest. Then came the bronze. The Hebrew word nekoshe could refer to copper or bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that was stronger and more durable than copper alone. The craftsman heated the metal until it flowed like liquid fire, then carefully applied it to every surface of the wooden frame, covering the acacia completely until no wood remained visible. The bronze plating served obvious practical purposes. It protected the wood from the fire that would burn upon the altar, prevented the structure from being consumed by the very flames it was designed to contain. But bronze carried symbolic weight as well, associations that any ancient Israelite would have understood. Bronze was the metal of strength and durability. It was harder than gold or silver, more resistant to damage, capable of withstanding pressures that would deform softer metals. The serpent that Moses had lifted up in the wilderness, the image that brought healing to those dying from snake bites, had been made of bronze. The pillars that would flank the entrance to Solomon's later temple would be cast in bronze, symbols of stability and permanence. To plate the altar in bronze was to declare that what happened here was not fragile or temporary, but solid and enduring, a foundation upon which Israel's entire relationship with God would rest. But bronze also carried associations with judgment. In prophetic literature, bronze appeared in contexts of divine testing and refinement, the furnace that purified, the fire that separated dross from precious metal. The bronze altar would be a place of fire, and fire in the biblical imagination was never merely destructive. It was the element of transformation, the force that changed one thing into another, that reduced complex substances to their essential components. The offerings that burned on the bronze altar were not being destroyed. They were being transformed, translated from earthly material into ascending smoke, from physical gift into spiritual transaction. At each of the altar's four corners, the craftsman fashioned horns, projections that extended upward from the top of the structure, integral to its design rather than added decorations. These horns would be smeared with the blood of certain sacrifices, marking them as especially sacred elements of the altar's surface. But the horns also served another purpose that would become significant in Israel's later history. They were places of refuge, points of sanctuary, where a person in danger could grasp and find protection. The altar that dealt in death was also designed to preserve life. The structure that received the blood of sacrificed animals could also shelter the desperate who clung to its corners. Bronze rings were attached to the sides of the altar, positioned to receive the poles that would be used to carry it when the camp moved. Like the Ark of the Covenant and the other sacred furniture, the altar was never meant to remain in one place permanently. It would accompany Israel through all their wanderings, carried on the shoulders of Levites, set up wherever God directed them to stop, dismantled again when the cloud lifted and signalled it was time to move on. The altar was mobile because the God it served was mobile, not bound to a single sacred site, but travelling with his people, meeting them wherever they found themselves. Beneath the bronze grating inside the altar, the craftsman installed a ledge or rim that ran around the interior, providing a surface where priests could stand when they needed to tend the higher portions of the fire or arrange sacrifices on the grating. The precise configuration has been debated by scholars across millennia. Some envision a ramp leading up to the altar's top, others a ledge accessible from within the hollow structure. But the purpose was clear. Human beings would need to interact physically with this sacred object, to climb and reach and arrange and tend, and the design accommodated that necessity while maintaining the altar's imposing presence. When the construction was complete, the bronze altar stood in the desert sun like something not entirely of this world. Gleaming metal and sturdy wood, massive yet portable, permanent in its purpose yet mobile in its placement. The craftsmen who had built it stepped back to survey their work, and perhaps they felt something of what artists always feel when a creation is finished. Satisfaction mixed with awe at what their hands had produced. Awareness that the object before them had somehow exceeded their own abilities to conceive or execute. The altar was beautiful in its severe way, not the delicate beauty of gold filigree or embroidered fabric, but the stark beauty of function perfectly embodied in form. Everything about its design served its purpose. The size declared importance. The bronze conveyed strength and judgment. The horns provided refuge. The rings enabled movement. The grating supported the fire. Every element worked together to create something that was exactly what it needed to be. A place where heaven and earth could meet, where the infinite distance between a holy God and a sinful people could be bridged by blood and fire and smoke. But the altar was not yet complete in the truest sense. An altar without fire is merely furniture, impressive perhaps, but inert, incapable of performing the function for which it was designed. The bronze could gleam in the sunlight, the horns could rise toward the sky, the entire structure could stand ready at the entrance of the courtyard, but until fire descended and offerings burned and smoke ascended, the altar remained potential rather than actual, promise rather than fulfillment. The fire was coming. The priests were being prepared. The nation was gathering for a moment that would transform the beautiful object in the courtyard into the beating heart of Israel's worship. But for now, in the quiet interval between construction and consecration, the altar simply waited. It waited for the flames that would give it life. It waited for the sacrifices that would give it meaning. It waited for the endless stream of worshippers who would approach its bronze sides with trembling hands and burdened hearts, seeking something that only fire could provide. The craftsmen had done their work well. Bezalel and Aholiab had translated divine blueprint into physical reality. The wood was shaped, the bronze was plated, the horns rose at the corners, the rings awaited their poles. Now it was God's turn. The altar stood ready, a meeting place between human brokenness and divine mercy, waiting for the holy fire that would seal the covenant and kindle a worship that would never entirely die. The people looked at what they had built, at the bronze gleaming in the desert light, at the structure that stood between them and the deeper mysteries of the tabernacle. They did not yet fully understand what it meant, but they would learn, one sacrifice at a time, one flame at a time, one encounter with holy fire at a time. They would learn what it meant to approach a God who was both consuming fire and infinite love. The altar was ready. The fire was about to fall. The day of consecration dawned with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath. The camp had been preparing for this moment through weeks of construction and ritual purification, through the careful assembly of every tabernacle element, according to the pattern revealed on the mountain. Now, on the first day of the first month of the second year after their departure from Egypt, the time had finally come. The tabernacle stood complete, its white linen curtains catching the early light, its bronze and gold surfaces gleaming with the newness of things never yet used for their intended purpose. And at the entrance to the courtyard, the bronze altar waited, empty, cold, ready to receive the fire that would transform it from sacred furniture into the living heart of Israel's worship. Moses had spent the preceding days in intense activity, anointing every element of the tabernacle with the special oil whose recipe God had provided, a fragrant mixture of myrrh, cinnamon, calamus, and cassia blended with olive oil, set apart exclusively for consecrating the sacred space and those who would serve within it. He had sprinkled this oil on the altar 7 times, sanctifying the bronze, setting it apart from every common object in the world, dedicating it to the singular purpose for which it had been created. The altar that had been built by human hands was now claimed by divine intention, no longer merely a product of craftsmanship but a portal between realms. But the tabernacle needed more than consecrated furniture. It needed consecrated servants, men set apart to tend its flames, to handle its sacrifices, to mediate between the holy God who dwelt within and the sinful people who approached from without. These men would be the priests, and their consecration would be as elaborate and meaningful as the consecration of the space itself. Aaron stood at the center of the ceremony, his 4 sons arranged beside him, Nadab and Abihu, the eldest, their faces solemn with the weight of what was being conferred upon them. Eleazar and Ithamar, the younger brothers, perhaps more nervous, certainly more aware of their youth and inexperience. They had been washed with water at the entrance to the tabernacle, their bodies cleansed as a symbol of the inner purification that the priesthood would require. They had been clothed in the special garments that God had designed for their office, white linen tunics, embroidered sashes, turbans wound around their heads. Aaron alone wore the additional vestments of the high priest, the blue robe with its golden bells and pomegranates, the ephod with its shoulder stones engraved with the names of Israel's tribes, the breastpiece bearing 12 gems that would carry those names over his heart whenever he entered the presence of God. The consecration offerings were elaborate: a bull for a sin offering, 2 rams for burnt offering and ordination, a basket of unleavened bread and cakes and wafers. Each element carried meaning, each sacrifice addressed a different dimension of the relationship being established between these men and the God they would serve. The sin offering acknowledged that even those chosen for sacred service were sinners who needed atonement before they could approach the holy. The burnt offering expressed complete dedication, the entire animal ascending to God in smoke as a symbol of the priests' total surrender to their calling. The ordination offering, literally the filling of the hands, signified the authority being transferred, the sacred responsibility being placed into hands that would henceforth belong to God rather than to themselves. Moses performed the sacrifices himself, acting as the mediating priest before there were priests to mediate. He slaughtered the bull, caught its blood in a basin, and applied it to the horns of the altar. Those 4 projections that rose at the corners, now receiving their first stain of crimson, the colour that would never entirely fade from them as long as the altar stood. He poured the remaining blood at the base of the altar, watching it soak into the desert ground, the life of the animal returning to the earth from which all life had originally come. Then he arranged the prescribed portions on the altar: the fat, the kidneys, the lobe of the liver, the elements that represented the innermost parts of the animal, the hidden sources of life and vitality. The moment had arrived. The offerings lay arranged on the bronze grating. The priests stood in their new garments. The people had gathered at a distance to witness what would happen next. But there was no fire yet on the altar. Moses had placed the wood, had arranged the sacrifices, had done everything that human preparation could do. What happened next would not come from human hands. The people watched in silence, thousands of them spread across the plain before the tabernacle, their eyes fixed on the altar where the morning light played across bronze and flesh and fat. Some had been present at Sinai when the mountain burned with the presence of God, when lightning and thunder had accompanied the giving of the law. They remembered that fire, remembered the terror and the awe that had gripped them as they confronted a God whose holiness was beyond anything they had imagined. Would that fire return now? Would the God who had spoken from the flames descend to dwell in the tent they had built for him? Moses stepped back from the altar and raised his hands over the congregation. His voice carried across the assembly with the authority of one who had spoken with God face to face, whose own skin still carried a lingering radiance from those encounters on the mountain. This is what the Lord has commanded you to do, so that the glory of the Lord may appear to you. The words hung in the desert air, pregnant with expectation. The glory of the Lord, the kavod, the weight and radiance and overwhelming presence of the divine, was about to manifest in ways they could see with their eyes and feel in their bodies. This was not merely religious ritual they were performing, not simply the inauguration of a new institution. This was an encounter with the living God, and encounters with the living God were never safe, never predictable, never ordinary. Aaron added his blessing to Moses's, lifting his hands toward the people in the gesture that would become the priestly benediction for all generations to come. Then both men entered the tabernacle itself, disappearing behind the curtains into the holy place where the lampstand burned and the incense altar waited. What they did inside, what prayers they offered, what final preparations they made, the watching crowd could not see. They could only wait, their hearts pounding, their breaths shallow, their entire beings focused on the altar that stood between them and the mysteries unfolding behind the linen walls. When Moses and Aaron emerged, they blessed the people again. And then it happened. Fire fell from heaven. It did not come gradually, did not spread slowly from some hidden ember. It descended with the suddenness of lightning, a column of flame that struck the altar with a force that seemed to shake the very ground beneath the watching thousands. The offerings that lay on the bronze grating, the fat, the organs, the carefully arranged portions, were consumed in an instant, transformed from physical substance into ascending smoke faster than the eye could follow. One moment they were there, solid and tangible. The next moment they were gone, and fire was dancing on the altar where they had lain. The flames that burned were not ordinary flames. They were not the yellow and orange of common fires, but something brighter, purer, more intense, colours that defied description, patterns that seemed to contain movement and meaning beyond the merely chemical reactions of combustion. This was holy fire, divine fire, fire that had originated not from sparks struck by human hands, but from the very presence of God himself. This was the fire that would burn perpetually on the altar, that the priests would be commanded to maintain day and night, that would never be allowed to go out as long as the tabernacle stood and Israel remained faithful to the covenant. The people's response was immediate and overwhelming. They shouted, a great cry that rose from thousands of throats simultaneously, a sound that blended terror and joy, fear and worship, the primal human response to encountering something utterly beyond ordinary experience. And then they fell on their faces, prostrating themselves in the dust before the altar, and the fire, and the God who had descended to dwell among them. The sound of that collective prostration, the thud of bodies hitting earth, the rustle of garments, the sudden silence that followed the shouting, was itself a kind of worship, perhaps the most authentic worship that human beings can offer. They had no words adequate to the moment. They had no rituals prescribed for such an encounter. They simply fell down, overwhelmed, undone, confronted with a reality so much larger than themselves that standing upright seemed presumptuous, speaking seemed inadequate, anything other than absolute surrender seemed impossible. For long moments, no one moved. The fire crackled on the altar, a sound that would become familiar but was not, yet familiar, still strange and new and laden with significance. The smoke rose in a steady column, white and fragrant, carrying the essence of the sacrifice upward toward the heavens from which the fire had fallen. The priests in their new garments remained motionless, as prostrate as the people they would serve, equally overwhelmed by what they had just witnessed. Even Moses, who had spoken with God on the mountain, who had seen the burning bush and the parting sea and wonders beyond counting, even he was silent before this new manifestation of the glory he had come to know. This was the moment when everything changed. Before the fire fell, the tabernacle had been an elaborate tent, impressive but inert. Before the fire fell, the altar had been beautiful metalwork, sacred in designation but not yet in function. Before the fire fell, the priests had been men in special clothing, appointed to roles they had not yet performed. But now the fire burned, and the smoke rose, and the presence of God had descended to take up residence in the structure his people had built. The altar had become what it was designed to be, the meeting place between earth and heaven, the location where human offerings encountered divine acceptance, the threshold that separated ordinary space from sacred space. From this moment forward, any Israelite who wished to approach God would approach through fire. Any sin that needed atonement would find it in blood poured at the altar's base. Any gratitude that sought expression would find voice in smoke ascending from the bronze grating. The altar was no longer an object but a relationship, no longer furniture but a doorway, no longer something they had built but something that would build them. The heat radiated outward from the altar, warmth that the people could feel even from their prostrate positions dozens of yards away. It was a living heat, a present heat, a reminder with every passing moment that the fire was real, the presence was real, the God who had called them out of Egypt had truly come to dwell among them. The fragrance of the burning offering drifted across the camp, a smell that would become as familiar as bread baking or incense burning, the olfactory signature of worship that would mark this people's life for generations. Slowly, hesitantly, the people began to raise their heads. Some wept openly, tears cutting channels through the dust that had settled on their faces during their prostration. Others simply stared at the altar, with expressions of wonder that words could not have captured. Children clung to parents, uncertain whether to be afraid or amazed, absorbing impressions that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The elderly, who remembered Egypt most vividly, who had spent the longest years in bondage, perhaps understood best what this moment meant, that the God who had delivered them had not abandoned them, that his presence would accompany them into whatever future awaited. The fire continued to burn. It would burn through that day and through the night that followed and through all the days and nights to come, tended by priests who would add wood to feed it, who would arrange offerings to sustain it, who would guard it against any interruption or extinction. This was not ordinary fire that could be rekindled from coals or sparked from flint. This was fire from heaven, and if it ever went out, no human means could restore it. The altar had received its purpose. The fire had received its home, and Israel had received something that would shape their identity for all the generations to come, a place where they could meet their God, a location where the terrible distance between human sinfulness and divine holiness could be bridged, a spot of ground where heaven and earth overlapped, and the God who dwelt in unapproachable light made himself approachable through blood, and fire and smoke. The first day of the tabernacle's operation was drawing toward noon, and already the altar had become what it would remain, the center of Israel's worship, the focus of their repentance, the foundation of their relationship with the God who had made himself known in ways no other nation had ever experienced. The fire burned on, and Israel began to learn what it meant to live in the presence of a holy God. The desert dawn broke slowly over the encampment, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that gradually gave way to the fierce blue of another Sinai morning. In the countless tents spread across the plain, families stirred from sleep, mothers kindling cooking fires, children rubbing eyes still heavy with dreams, fathers preparing for whatever labours the day would bring. The rhythms of ordinary life resumed with the rising sun, the same rhythms that had marked human existence since the beginning, the ancient patterns of waking and working and eating and resting that connected this generation to all the generations that had come before. But there was something different now, something that distinguished this encampment from every other gathering of human beings anywhere in the world. At the centre of the camp, visible from almost every vantage point, smoke was already rising from the bronze altar. The priests had been at work since before the first light touched the horizon, tending the fire that never slept, preparing for the sacrifice that would greet each new day as surely as the sun greeted the sky. The morning burnt offering was called the Tamid, the continual or perpetual sacrifice, and its name captured its essence. Every morning, without exception, a year-old lamb without blemish was brought to the altar. Every evening, as the sun descended toward the western hills, another lamb was offered. Day after day, week after week, month after month, the rhythm continued unbroken, a heartbeat of worship that pulsed at the center of Israel's communal life. The smoke that rose from these offerings was as constant as breathing, as regular as the turning of the earth, a perpetual reminder that the relationship between God and his people required perpetual attention. The priests who performed these daily sacrifices moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had repeated the same actions hundreds of times. They had learned exactly how to approach the altar, how to handle the animal with reverence, how to make the cut that would end its life swiftly and humanely. They had learned where to catch the blood as it flowed, how to dash it against the sides of the altar in the prescribed pattern, how to arrange the portions on the fire so that they would burn completely and evenly. What had once been strange and solemn had become familiar through repetition, though never, if they were faithful to their calling, had it become merely routine. The lamb that died each morning died for the entire nation. Its blood represented their collective acknowledgement that they had fallen short of God's standards during the night that had passed, that they needed cleansing before they could begin another day in the presence of the Holy One. Its ascending smoke carried their corporate prayers toward heaven, their gratitude for preservation through the darkness, their petition for guidance and provision in the hours ahead. No individual Israelite had to bring this offering. It was provided from the community's resources, offered on everyone's behalf. But every Israelite benefited from it, covered by its atonement, included in its dedication, represented in its ascending fragrance. The evening sacrifice performed the same function as the day drew to its close. Whatever sins had accumulated during the hours of labour and interaction, whatever failures had marked the community's life since the morning offering, were addressed by the lamb that died as shadows lengthened across the camp. The day ended as it had begun, with blood, with fire, with smoke rising toward a God who had chosen to dwell among people who constantly needed his mercy. The brackets of each day were marked not by the position of the sun alone, but by the sacrifices that acknowledged human dependence on divine grace. But the daily burnt offerings were only the foundation. Built upon this perpetual rhythm was an elaborate structure of additional sacrifices that addressed the full range of human experience and need. The altar received them all, its bronze surface never cool, its fire never idle, its purpose never exhausted by the steady stream of offerings that approached it from morning until night. Families came with their own sacrifices, bringing animals from their flocks when circumstances required or gratitude prompted. A woman who had given birth would come after her period of purification, bringing a lamb for a burnt offering and a pigeon for a sin offering, presenting herself and her child before the Lord who had granted new life. A man who had recovered from a serious illness might bring a thanksgiving offering, the meat shared in a meal of celebration with family and friends, a portion burned on the altar as acknowledgement that healing came from God. A farmer whose crops had flourished, a shepherd whose flocks had multiplied, a merchant whose ventures had prospered. All of these might approach the altar with offerings that expressed the gratitude words alone could not contain. The sin offerings addressed a different dimension of human experience. These were brought when someone became aware that they had violated God's commands, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The wealthy brought bulls, those of modest means brought goats or sheep, the poor brought birds, 2 doves or 2 pigeons, one for a sin offering and one for a burnt offering. The sliding scale ensured that no one was excluded from atonement by poverty, that the path to forgiveness was open to everyone regardless of their economic status. The altar did not discriminate between the offerings of the rich and the poor. It received them all, and the God who looked upon the altar valued the heart behind the gift more than the size of the gift itself. There were guilt offerings for specific violations, compensation for wrongs done to others combined with sacrifice that addressed the offence against God. There were peace offerings that celebrated restored relationship, shared meals that included portions for the altar, portions for the priests, and portions for the worshipper and their guests. There were offerings for inadvertent sins, for deliberate sins confessed and repented, for sins of omission and sins of commission. The sacrificial system was comprehensive, addressing every imaginable failure, providing a pathway back to right relationship for every conceivable departure from God's standards. The priests who served at the altar became intimately familiar with the struggles of their people. They saw the tears of those who came with sin offerings, the relief that washed over faces when the blood was applied, and the atonement declared. They witnessed the joy of those who brought thanksgiving offerings, the celebration that surrounded the shared meals in the Tabernacle's courtyard. They heard the whispered confessions, the expressions of remorse, the tentative hope that perhaps this time the failure would be forgiven and the slate wiped clean. The altar made them witnesses to the full range of human emotion, guilt and gratitude, sorrow and celebration, despair and hope intermingled in the smoke that rose perpetually toward heaven. For the ordinary Israelite, the approach to the altar was never casual. Even those who came frequently, who had made the journey dozens of times before, felt something shift within them as they passed through the courtyard entrance and saw the bronze gleaming in the sunlight, the fire burning, the smoke ascending. This was the threshold between ordinary life and sacred encounter, the boundary between the camp where human activities dominated and the space where God's presence concentrated. To pass through that entrance was to step out of the mundane and into the holy, to leave behind the assumptions of everyday existence and enter a realm where different rules applied. The worshipper would bring their animal, a lamb perhaps, or a goat from their flock, and present it to the priest at the north side of the altar. The animal represented them. It stood in their place, a substitute that would bear what they deserved. They would lay their hands on its head, not merely touching it but pressing down with intention, symbolically transferring their guilt to the innocent creature that was about to die on their behalf. In some cases, they would confess their sins aloud during this moment of identification, naming the specific failures that had brought them to this place, acknowledging before God and priest alike that they had fallen short and needed mercy. Then the animal was slaughtered and the blood was collected. Blood was central to everything that happened at the altar, and its significance was rooted in the earliest revelations God had given to humanity. The life of the flesh is in the blood, the Torah declared, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls, for it is the blood that makes atonement by reason of the life. The blood represented life, not merely biological existence, but the animating force that distinguished living creatures from dead matter. When blood was poured out at the base of the altar, life was being given. When blood was applied to the horns or dashed against the sides, life was being offered in place of the life that had been forfeited through sin. The exchange was stark and sobering. The worshipper deserved death, not physical execution necessarily, but the separation from God that was the ultimate consequence of sin. The animal died instead, its life substituted for the life of the one who had laid hands upon its head. The blood that flowed was innocent blood, the blood of a creature that had done nothing wrong, poured out to cover the guilt of one who had done much wrong. There was nothing pretty about this transaction, nothing sanitized or symbolic in a merely intellectual sense. It was visceral, physical, impossible to ignore. The one who brought a sin offering saw the animal die, smelled the blood, watched their substitute's life drain away so that their own life could continue in relationship with God. And yet, for all its solemnity, the altar was not primarily a place of death. It was a place of life, life restored, life renewed, life made possible through the death that preceded it. The worshipper who approached with burdened conscience left with lightened heart. The guilt that had accumulated since their last visit, the specific failure that had prompted this particular sacrifice, had been addressed. The blood had been applied. The offering had ascended. God had received what was required, and the relationship that sin had disrupted was restored. The horns of the altar added another dimension to its significance. These projections at the four corners, perpetually stained with the blood of countless sin offerings, became associated with refuge and protection. Later in Israel's history, when someone faced danger, when a person fleeing vengeance grasped the horns of the altar, clinging to them as a drowning person might cling to a rock in a flood, they were invoking the altar's power to protect as well as to purify. The altar that received the blood of sinners could also shelter the bodies of the desperate. The place where death was dealt could also be the place where life was preserved. This duality captured something essential about the nature of the God whom the altar served. He was holy, utterly, blazingly, terrifyingly holy, and his holiness demanded that sin be addressed with the seriousness it deserved. The blood that flowed at the altar acknowledged this reality. It testified that sin was not trivial, that breaking covenant with God carried consequences, that the moral structure of the universe was not negotiable. But this same God was merciful, compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. He did not desire the death of sinners, he desired their restoration. He had provided the sacrificial system not to multiply death, but to make life possible, not to create barriers, but to open pathways, not to shame his people, but to receive them back into relationship. The altar, then, was both judgment and grace, both severity and kindness, both the place where sin was taken with ultimate seriousness and the place where sinners found ultimate welcome. Day after day, year after year, the smoke rose and the blood flowed and the people came, learning through repetition what they could never have learned through instruction alone, that they were dependent creatures, that they needed mercy constantly, that their God was both holy enough to require sacrifice and loving enough to provide it. Through this endless rhythm of offering and atonement, the altar was shaping the soul of a nation. It was forming in them habits of repentance and gratitude, awareness of sin, and confidence in forgiveness. It was teaching them to approach God not with the casual familiarity that breeds contempt, nor with the terrified distance that prevents relationship, but with the reverent intimacy of children who know their Father is both powerful and kind. The smoke that rose from the bronze altar was not merely the residue of burning flesh. It was the visible evidence of a people learning to worship, learning to trust, learning to live in the presence of a God who was unlike any other God the ancient world had ever imagined. The fire burned day and night. The priests performed their duties morning and evening. The people came with their offerings, their confessions, their thanksgivings, their desperate need for mercy. And slowly, sacrifice by sacrifice, the altar was making them into what they were called to be: a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, a people belonging to God. The tragedy struck without warning, on a day that should have been filled with nothing but celebration. The consecration ceremonies had concluded successfully. The fire from heaven had fallen. The people had witnessed the glory of the Lord and had prostrated themselves in awe. Aaron and his sons had been installed in their sacred office, their hands filled with the authority to mediate between God and Israel, their garments marking them as set apart for holy service. Everything had proceeded exactly as Moses had commanded, exactly as God had revealed on the mountain. The tabernacle was operational, the altar was burning, and the new era of Israel's worship had begun. Nadab and Abihu were the eldest sons. the ones who would have been watching most carefully, learning most intently, preparing themselves for the day when they would assume their father's mantle of high priestly leadership. They had been present at Sinai when the elders of Israel ascended the mountain and saw God, saw the pavement beneath his feet like sapphire, clear as the sky itself. They had eaten and drunk in his presence, a covenant meal that should have sealed their understanding of both his majesty and his mercy. They had witnessed the fire fall on the altar, had felt the ground tremble beneath them, had heard the shout of the people and watched them fall on their faces. They knew, as well as anyone in Israel could know, exactly who they were dealing with, and yet something went terribly wrong. The text describes their action with devastating brevity. Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer, put fire in it, and laid incense on it, and they offered strange fire before the Lord, which he had not commanded them. Strange fire, unauthorized fire, fire that came from somewhere other than the altar where God's own flame burned perpetually. The Hebrew phrase Eshazara suggested something foreign, something alien to the sacred system that had just been established. Perhaps they had kindled their own flames from ordinary sources. Perhaps they had approached at an unauthorized time, or in an unauthorized manner, or with attitudes that treated the holy as common. The text does not specify exactly what made their fire strange, and perhaps that ambiguity is intentional, a warning that the boundaries of the sacred are not always obvious, and must therefore be approached with extreme caution. What is clear is that their action was something God had not commanded. In a system where every detail had been revealed from the mountain, where the recipe for incense and the formula for anointing oil, and the precise dimensions of every piece of furniture had been specified with divine precision. Doing something God had not commanded was not a minor deviation. It was a fundamental violation of the principle that governed Israel's worship, that human beings did not get to decide how to approach a holy God. He decided, he revealed, they obeyed. Any departure from this pattern, however well-intentioned, was not worship but presumption. The response was immediate and terrible. Fire went out from the Lord and consumed them, and they died before the Lord. The same fire that had fallen from heaven to accept the offerings, the same divine flame that had ignited worship and drawn forth shouts of joy, now struck down 2 of the priests who were meant to tend it. The fire that had shown mercy now showed judgment. The presence that had drawn near in grace now demonstrated that grace did not mean permissiveness, that love did not mean the abandonment of standards, that the God who welcomed sinners through the proper channels would not tolerate those who invented their own channels. Nadab and Abihu died in the Tabernacle courtyard, within sight of the altar they had been ordained to serve, their bodies consumed by the same holy fire that burned perpetually on the bronze grating. One moment they were priests in their sacred garments, censers in hand, incense smoking before them. The next moment they were corpses, their ministry ended before it had properly begun, their potential forever unfulfilled. The silence that followed must have been absolute and horrifying. Aaron stood frozen, watching the smoke rise from what remained of his eldest sons. The father who had blessed them during the consecration ceremony, who had watched them grow from infants to young men, who had surely dreamed of the day they would assume leadership of Israel's worship, this father now confronted a loss so sudden and so devastating that words were impossible. The text says simply that Aaron held his peace. He was silent. Whether this was the silence of shock, of faith, of suppressed rage, or of all these mingled together, the text does not say. It simply records that he did not speak. Moses too struggled to find adequate words. What he said to Aaron has troubled readers for millennia. This is what the Lord spoke, saying, "By those who come near me I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be glorified." It was not comfort in any conventional sense. It was explanation, an attempt to help Aaron understand that what had happened, however devastating, was not arbitrary. God's holiness demanded that those who approached him do so with reverence, and his glory required that violations of that holiness be addressed publicly. Nadab and Abihu had been near to God by virtue of their office, and nearness to God carried responsibilities that casual worshippers might never face. The nation watched, and the nation learned. The joy of the previous days gave way to a more sober understanding of what it meant to serve a holy God. The fire that had evoked shouts of celebration now evoked trembling awareness that this same fire could consume as well as accept. The altar that had seemed like a gift, a means of approaching God, a pathway to forgiveness, was also a boundary, a reminder that the holy was not to be trifled with, that the God who provided sacrifice also determined how sacrifice was to be offered. Moses commanded that Nadab and Abihu's bodies be carried outside the camp, their priestly garments still upon them, their remains removed by cousins rather than by Aaron and his surviving sons, who were forbidden to show the normal signs of mourning, lest it appear that they were challenging God's judgment. The restriction was harsh, and it underscored the severity of the moment. Even grief had to bow before the requirements of holiness. Even a father's tears had to be contained in the face of divine justice. The incident cast a long shadow over Israel's worship for generations to come. The warning embedded in the story of Nadab and Abihu became a perpetual reminder to every priest who served at the altar. The fire you tend is not your fire. The incense you offer must be offered as commanded. The boundaries that separate the holy from the common are not suggestions but requirements, and crossing them carelessly can be fatal. The grace that provides access to God does not eliminate the need for reverence. If anything, it increases it. The closer one comes to the holy, the more dangerous the holy becomes to those who treat it as ordinary. But the tragedy of misused fire was not limited to those early days in the wilderness. As centuries passed and Israel settled in the Promised Land, as the portable tabernacle gave way to Solomon's magnificent temple in Jerusalem, the temptation to modify, improve, or replace God's prescribed worship proved irresistible to kings and priests who should have known better. Ahaz came to the throne of Judah in a time of political crisis. The northern kingdom of Israel had allied with Syria against him, threatening invasion if he did not join their coalition against the rising power of Assyria. Caught between competing empires, pressured by neighbours who should have been brothers, Ahaz made a decision that would define his legacy. He sought help from Assyria itself, stripping the temple of its treasures to purchase the Assyrian king's protection. But the political compromise was only the beginning. When Ahaz travelled to Damascus to meet his new patron, he encountered an altar that captured his imagination, a magnificent structure built according to Syrian design, impressive in its craftsmanship, representing the sophisticated religious culture of a civilization far older than Israel. Ahaz was entranced. He sent detailed measurements back to Jerusalem, commanding the priest Urijah to construct a replica before his return. Urijah, who should have refused, who should have remembered Nadab and Abihu, who should have understood that the altars of Israel were not subject to royal redesign, instead complied. When Ahaz returned to Jerusalem, he found his new altar standing in the temple courtyard, positioned in the place of prominence that had always belonged to the bronze altar of burnt offering. The king immediately began offering sacrifices on this foreign structure. The morning burnt offering, the evening grain offering, the sacrifices of the king and the people. The ancient altar, the one whose design had been revealed to Moses on Sinai, whose fire had fallen from heaven, whose bronze had received the blood of countless sin offerings, was pushed aside, relegated to secondary status, used only for the king's personal inquiries. The text records this desecration with a restraint that barely conceals its horror. Ahaz had done what Nadab and Abihu had done on a grander scale. He had introduced strange fire into Israel's worship, substituting human design for divine revelation, preferring the impressive innovations of pagan culture to the faithful traditions of covenant worship. The fire from heaven did not fall to consume him, as it had consumed Aaron's sons, but the judgment was coming nonetheless. Within a generation, the northern kingdom would fall to Assyria, its people scattered among the nations, never to return as a distinct entity. Judah would survive longer, but the rot that Ahaz introduced would spread until eventually Jerusalem itself fell and the temple was destroyed. The contrast between Nadab and Abihu's immediate judgment and Ahaz's delayed consequences raises questions that the text does not fully answer. Why did fire consume the priest but not the king? Why did God tolerate for years what he had punished in an instant? Perhaps the answer lies in the different nature of their access to the holy. The priests who served daily at the altar faced stricter standards than kings, who approached occasionally. Perhaps the delay was itself a form of mercy, an extended opportunity for repentance that Ahaz never seized. Perhaps God's ways simply exceed human understanding. his timing governed by wisdom that sees further than any mortal can perceive. What remained constant was the principle. The holy fire demanded holy handling. The altar that God had designed could not be replaced by altars that humans preferred. The worship that God had commanded could not be supplemented with worship that humans invented. Throughout Israel's history, the temptation recurred to add, to modify, to update, to adapt. And throughout Israel's history, the consequences accumulated: distance from God, loss of power, eventual exile and destruction. The fire that had fallen from heaven in mercy would eventually fall in judgment, consuming not just individuals but the entire nation that had persistently treated the holy as common. The stories of Nadab and Abihu and Ahaz stood as warnings across the generations, cautionary tales that every priest knew and every king should have heeded. They testified that human creativity, however impressive, could not improve upon divine revelation. They declared that good intentions did not excuse unauthorized innovations. They reminded Israel that the God who had condescended to dwell among them was still the God whose holiness demanded reverence, whose glory would be upheld regardless of human preferences, whose fire could warm or consume depending on how it was approached. The altar continued to stand in the Tabernacle courtyard, and later in the temple that Solomon built. The fire continued to burn, tended by priests who passed down the traditions from father to son, generation after generation. The smoke continued to rise, carrying the prayers and offerings of a nation that was learning, slowly and sometimes painfully, what it meant to worship a God who was both infinitely merciful and uncompromisingly holy. The lessons were costly, the warnings were severe, but they were necessary, because the same fire that purified could destroy, and the difference lay entirely in how it was approached. Human inconsistency met divine consistency at the altar, and the results were written in blood and flame across the pages of Israel's history. The fire still burned, but it burned according to its own nature, not according to human wishes, and those who understood this thrived, while those who forgot it perished. For nearly 1,500 years the smoke rose. Through the wilderness wanderings and the conquest of Canaan, through the period of judges and the rise of kings, through the glory of Solomon's temple and the devastation of its destruction, through the return from exile and the building of the Second Temple, the sacrifices continued. Lambs died on morning after morning. Blood was poured out at the altar's base evening after evening. The rhythm that had begun in the Sinai desert persisted across the centuries, an endless heartbeat of worship that marked the passage of time with the regularity of sunrise and sunset. Millions of animals perished on the altars of Israel during those long centuries. The blood of bulls and goats and lambs soaked into the ground around the bronze structure until the earth itself must have been saturated with it. The smoke that rose from burning fat and flesh filled the air of the tabernacle courtyard, then the temple courts, becoming so familiar that worshippers could probably identify the different offerings by scent alone. Generation after generation of priests learned the sacred choreography, passing down the traditions from father to son, maintaining the fire, applying the blood, arranging the portions, performing the same rituals their ancestors had performed since the days when Moses stood at the foot of Mount Sinai. And yet, for all its constancy, for all its faithfulness, for all the millions of lives offered and gallons of blood poured out, something remained incomplete. The writer to the Hebrews, reflecting on this ancient system from the vantage point of its fulfillment, put the matter with striking clarity. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. The statement would have shocked those who heard it first, contradicting as it seemed everything they had been taught about the sacrificial system. Had not God himself commanded these offerings? Had not the fire from heaven fallen to accept them? Had not the priests faithfully performed them for century upon century, assuring countless worshippers that their sins were covered, their guilt atoned, their relationship with God restored? All of this was true, and yet all of this was incomplete. The sacrifices of the Old Covenant were real, but they were also shadows, substantial enough to provide genuine benefit in their own time, yet insubstantial when compared to the reality toward which they pointed. They covered sin without removing it. They provided temporary relief without permanent solution. They had to be repeated endlessly precisely, because they could never accomplish finally what they symbolized. The very repetition that made them central to Israel's life also testified to their inadequacy. If the blood of bulls and goats could truly take away sin, why did it need to be offered again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, world without end? The altar, for all its importance, was a shadow. The fire, for all its divine origin, was a picture. The entire elaborate system of sacrifice that had shaped Israel's worship and identity for 15 centuries was, in the end, a preparation, a visual aid designed to teach God's people what sin cost, what mercy required, what the bridge between human failure and divine holiness would eventually look like. They were learning the vocabulary, practicing the grammar, rehearsing the concepts that would one day find their ultimate expression in something the prophets glimpsed but could not fully describe. Isaiah had seen it, or something of it, 700 years before its arrival. He wrote of a servant who would be wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, upon whom the Lord laid the iniquity of us all. This servant would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, silent before his shearers, cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of his people. He would be a guilt offering, Isaiah said, using the precise technical language of the sacrificial system to describe something that transcended any sacrifice ever offered on any altar. The lamb that every Israelite knew, the offering that every priest had performed, would find its ultimate expression in a person, a servant, a suffering figure who would bear what no animal could truly bear. Jeremiah had prophesied a new covenant, different from the one made at Sinai, written not on tablets of stone but on human hearts. This new covenant would accomplish what the old covenant could only symbolize: actual forgiveness, complete removal of sin, relationship with God based not on repeated sacrifice, but on something done once and for all. I will forgive their wickedness, God declared through the prophet, and will remember their sins no more. The endless repetition would give way to a single act so comprehensive that nothing would need to be added to it. Ever. Daniel had glimpsed the timing, calculating weeks of years that pointed toward a moment when the Anointed One would be cut off and would put an end to sacrifice and offering. The phrase was remarkable in its implications. The entire sacrificial system that had defined Israel's relationship with God would somehow cease to be necessary, rendered obsolete by something the Anointed One would accomplish through being cut off. The altar fires that had burned for so long would eventually go out, not because Israel had failed to tend them, but because they were no longer needed. These prophetic hints accumulated across the centuries, accumulating like kindling waiting for a spark. The faithful in Israel, those who paid attention to what the prophets said and pondered the meaning of their own endless sacrifices, must have wondered when and how the fulfillment would come. What kind of offering could accomplish what millions of animals could not? What kind of priest could perform a sacrifice that never needed repeating? What kind of altar could receive a gift so comprehensive that it would render all previous gifts obsolete? The answer arrived in a stable in Bethlehem, announced by angels to shepherds, who were probably watching over lambs destined for the temple sacrifices. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The Greek word for dwelt being skenu, which carried the same root as the Hebrew word for tabernacle. God had taken up residence among his people once again, but this time not in a tent of fabric and wood. This time he had pitched his tabernacle in human flesh, had wrapped divine glory in infant skin, had entered the creation he had made as a participant rather than merely a presence. For 30 years he grew in wisdom and stature, learning the trade of a carpenter, attending the feasts in Jerusalem where the altar still stood and the fire still burned, watching the endless procession of lambs and bulls and goats that ascended in smoke toward a heaven he knew more intimately than any priest could imagine. He participated in the system, observed its rituals, honoured its requirements, all while knowing that he himself was what the entire system had been designed to foreshadow. John the Baptist recognised him before his public ministry began. Standing at the Jordan River, watching Jesus approach through the crowd, the prophet declared with sudden certainty, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." The title was extraordinary, connecting this carpenter from Nazareth with every lamb that had ever died on Israel's altar, every Passover offering whose blood had been applied to Hebrew doorposts, every morning and evening sacrifice whose smoke had risen from the bronze altar since the fire first fell from heaven. This man was the Lamb, not a lamb, one among many, but the Lamb, the ultimate fulfillment of everything the sacrificial system had been pointing toward. And he was a lamb who would take away sin, not merely cover it, not temporarily address it, not symbolically acknowledge it, but actually remove it. The Greek verb John used suggested lifting up and carrying away, permanent removal rather than temporary concealment. What the blood of bulls and goats could never accomplish, this lamb would accomplish. What the altar in the temple could never provide, this lamb would provide. The endless repetition was about to end, replaced by a single sacrifice of infinite value. The ministry that followed demonstrated his qualifications for this ultimate role. He healed the sick, showing his authority over the physical corruption that sin had introduced into creation. He cast out demons, proving his power over the spiritual forces that held humanity in bondage. He forgave sins, claiming a prerogative that belonged to God alone and shocking the religious authorities who understood exactly what he was implying. He taught with an authority that exceeded even the greatest rabbis, speaking not as one who interpreted the law, but as one who had written it. But these demonstrations, impressive as they were merely prelude. The purpose for which he had come remained ahead of him, drawing him inexorably toward Jerusalem, toward the temple, toward a confrontation with the religious establishment and the political powers that would culminate in something the prophets had foretold, but the disciples could not comprehend until after it happened. On the night before his death, he gathered his disciples for a final meal, a Passover meal filled with symbols that reached back to that night in Egypt, when blood on doorposts had marked the difference between death and deliverance. He took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them with words that reinterpreted everything they thought they understood. "This is my body, given for you." He took the cup of wine, gave thanks, and offered it with words equally stunning. "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." Body given, blood poured out. The language was unmistakably sacrificial, connecting this meal with everything that happened at the bronze altar, identifying Jesus himself as the offering that would accomplish what all previous offerings had only symbolized. He was not merely teaching about sacrifice, he was becoming it. He was not merely interpreting the old covenant, he was inaugurating the new one. The bread and wine that his followers would continue to share in his memory would forever after point backward to this night and forward to its fulfillment the following day. Calvary was not a Roman execution ground. It was an altar. The cross that held Jesus' broken body was the altar upon which the ultimate sacrifice was offered, not by human priests who approached with knives and basins, but by the Father who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all. The blood that flowed from wounds in his hands and feet and side was the blood that would accomplish what millions of gallons of animal blood had never accomplished. Actual removal of sin, permanent reconciliation with God, the end of separation between creator and creature. He was the Lamb, as John had declared, innocent, spotless, without blemish, bearing the sins of others rather than his own. He was the priest, as the letter to the Hebrews would later explain, not after the order of Aaron with its hereditary succession and endless repetition, but after the order of Melchizedek with its eternal permanence and unrepeatable sufficiency. He was the offering, voluntarily laying down his life, not taken from him by force but given freely in obedience to the Father's will. And he was the altar, the meeting place between heaven and earth, the location where divine justice and divine mercy converged in a transaction that would echo through eternity. "It is finished," he declared with his dying breath, and the Greek word tetelestai was a commercial term meaning paid in full. The debt that the bronze altar had acknowledged for 15 centuries, the debt that required endless payments of blood and fire and smoke, was finally discharged. The account was settled. The sacrifice was complete. At that moment, the veil in the temple tore from top to bottom, not from bottom to top, as would have happened if human hands had ripped it, but from top to bottom, as if God himself were opening the way into his presence that the old system had so carefully guarded. The Holy of Holies, accessible only once a year to the high priest alone, was suddenly exposed. The barrier was removed. The way was open. The fire on the bronze altar continued to burn for a few more decades, tended by priests who did not yet understand that their services had been rendered obsolete. The temple itself would stand until the Romans destroyed it in 70 AD, its sacrificial system continuing even as the early church proclaimed that the true sacrifice had already been offered. But for those with eyes to see, the altar in the temple had become a monument to something already accomplished, a shadow that persisted after the reality had arrived. The bronze altar had done its work. It had taught God's people, across 15 centuries of daily sacrifice, what sin cost and what mercy required. It had established the vocabulary that made the cross comprehensible: blood, offering, atonement, substitution. It had pointed forward with every ascending column of smoke toward a day when smoke would no longer be necessary, when the Lamb who takes away sin would render all other lambs redundant. The altar's ancient meaning had blossomed into eternal significance, and the fire that had burned in the wilderness now burned in human hearts, ignited not by flames falling from the sky, but by the Spirit of the risen Christ, transforming all who received him into living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. The bronze altar could finally rest. Its purpose had been fulfilled. The physical altar has long since vanished. The bronze that gleamed in the desert sun, that received the blood of countless offerings, that bore the marks of fire falling from heaven, it disappeared into history along with the tabernacle that housed it. When Solomon built his temple, he constructed a new altar, larger and more magnificent, but built on the same principles and serving the same purpose. When that temple fell to Babylon, the altar fell with it. When the exiles returned and built the second temple, they built another altar, and that too served until the Romans came in 70 AD and left not one stone upon another. Today, no altar stands in Jerusalem. The Temple Mount remains, a contested piece of real estate where politics and religion intertwine in ways that resist easy resolution. Tourists and pilgrims walk where the priests once walked, photograph locations where the smoke once rose, try to imagine a system of worship that has not functioned for nearly 2,000 years. The bronze altar exists now only in memory, in the pages of Scripture, in the imaginations of those who read those pages, in the theological reflections of communities that trace their spiritual ancestry back to that first fire falling from heaven. And yet, in another sense, the altar has never been more present. The physical structure may have vanished, but the reality it represented has been internalized, democratized, extended to every human being who approaches God through the sacrifice that ended all sacrifices. The altar that once stood in a courtyard now stands in human hearts. The fire that once burned on bronze now burns within those who have received the Spirit of the living God. The worship that once required priests and animals in specific locations now rises from kitchens and offices, from hospital rooms and prison cells, from every place where a human soul turns toward the God who gave his Son to make approach possible. This internalization was always part of the plan. The prophets had glimpsed it centuries before Christ came. Jeremiah speaking of a law written on hearts rather than tablets, David confessing that the sacrifices God truly desired were a broken spirit and a contrite heart. The external system was never meant to be permanent. It was scaffolding, necessary during the construction phase, but destined to be removed once the building was complete. Now the building stands, and the scaffolding is gone, and what remains is something more beautiful than the structure it helped to build. The altar of the heart is always accessible. There are no limited hours, no priestly gatekeepers, no requirements to travel to a specific location or wait for a designated feast day. At any moment, in any place, under any circumstances, a human being can approach God through Christ and find the welcome that the bronze altar could only symbolize. The blood has already been applied. The sacrifice has already been offered. The fire has already been kindled. All that remains is for the worshipper to come, to bring whatever they carry, to lay it down in the presence of the one who has made approach possible, to receive the mercy that flows from an altar whose work is finished but whose benefits never end. What do we bring to this altar of the heart? We bring our burdens, the weights that accumulate in the course of ordinary life, the responsibilities that press down upon shoulders not designed to carry them indefinitely, the anxieties that multiply in the quiet hours when sleep refuses to come. The ancient Israelite brought a lamb or a goat, a tangible offering that represented something intangible, their acknowledgement of need, their dependence on mercy, their trust that God would receive what they offered. We bring these same intangible realities without the tangible intermediary, laying our burdens directly before the throne of grace, trusting that the one sacrifice offered for all time covers everything we carry. We bring our regrets, the accumulated weight of words spoken that should have been swallowed, of actions taken that should have been resisted, of opportunities missed and relationships damaged and potential squandered. The sin offering of the Old Covenant addressed precisely these realities, providing a mechanism for guilt to be acknowledged and atonement to be received. That mechanism has been fulfilled but not abolished. It has been transformed from repeated ritual into permanent reality. The blood of Christ speaks better things than the blood of Abel, better things than the blood of any animal ever offered on any altar. It speaks forgiveness, complete and final, to everyone who brings their regrets to the altar where that blood was shed. We bring our prayers, the articulated hopes and fears, the requests and intercessions, the groanings too deep for words that the Spirit translates into language heaven can understand. Prayer was always part of the altar's function. The smoke that rose from the offerings was understood as a picture of prayers ascending to God, a visible representation of invisible communication between earth and heaven. That communication continues, unmediated now by smoke and fire, direct and immediate through the access that Christ's sacrifice has provided. We pray not toward a distant deity, but to a Father who has welcomed us into his presence, who hears us not because of our eloquence, but because of the Son who stands as our advocate, whose blood has purchased our right to speak. We bring our gratitude, the thanksgiving that rises spontaneously when we recognize how much we have received, how little we deserve, how gracious God has been in treating us according to mercy rather than justice. The peace offerings of the Old Covenant were expressions of exactly this gratitude, animals sacrificed not because of any specific sin, but simply because the worshipper's heart was full and needed to overflow in tangible expression. Our hearts still fill with gratitude, still need to overflow, still require some channel through which the thankfulness can flow toward the God who deserves it. The altar of the heart receives these offerings and transforms them into worship, into joy, into the kind of a life that becomes itself an offering of praise. But perhaps most importantly, we bring ourselves. This was always the deepest meaning of the altar, the reality that the animals and the blood and the fire were designed to teach, that God wanted not merely our gifts but our lives, not merely our offerings but our hearts, not merely the smoke of burning flesh, but the surrender of human wills to divine purposes. The sacrifice that truly pleases God has always been the sacrifice of self, not self-destruction, not the annihilation of personhood, but the yielding of autonomy, the submission of personal agenda to kingdom purposes, the daily decision to present our bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable, which is our reasonable service. The altar of the heart is where this surrender happens. It is the interior space where we encounter the holy fire and allow it to do its work in us, burning away what needs to be consumed, purifying what needs to be refined, transforming what needs to be changed. The fire that fell from heaven onto the bronze altar was the same fire that appeared at Pentecost as tongues resting on each believer's head. The fire of God's presence, now internalized, now dwelling within rather than merely among, now working from the inside out rather than the outside in. This fire still burns for anyone willing to receive it. It burns for the one who carries guilt that seems too heavy to bear, whose failures replay in memory like an endless loop of accusation and shame. The altar that received sin offerings for centuries still receives sinners now, still offers the same atonement that the blood of bulls and goats could only shadow. Come to the altar, lay down the guilt, receive the forgiveness that flows from a sacrifice already completed, a debt already paid, a separation already healed. It burns for the one who carries grief that seems too deep to survive, whose losses have hollowed out places in the heart that nothing seems able to fill. The altar was always a place where the reality of death was confronted, where the cost of broken relationship with God was acknowledged, where the terrible price of sin was paid in blood and fire. But it was also a place of life, the meeting point where death was transformed into hope, where ending became beginning, where the smoke that rose toward heaven carried with it the promise that death was not the final word. Come to the altar, lay down the grief, receive the comfort that flows from a God who himself entered death and emerged victorious on the other side. It burns for the one who carries fear that seems too powerful to overcome, whose anxieties multiply like waves crashing against a shore that keeps eroding under their assault. The altar was a place of ultimate security, a location where the horns could be grasped by the desperate who had nowhere else to turn. That security remains available, not in physical horns of bronze, but in the spiritual reality of a God who has promised never to leave or forsake, whose presence surrounds those who take refuge in him, whose peace surpasses understanding and guards hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Come to the altar, lay down the fear, receive the peace that flows from the one who commands even the winds and the waves to be still. It burns for the one who carries nothing at all, whose life seems empty of both great sins and great sorrows, whose days pass in ordinary routine without dramatic crisis or obvious need. The altar was never only for emergencies. It was the daily centre of Israel's life, the morning and evening rhythm that shaped existence, whether anything unusual was happening or not. Ordinary life requires grace just as extraordinary life does. Mundane days need the presence of God just as much as crisis days do. Come to the altar, lay down the ordinariness, receive the transformation that turns routine into worship, that infuses daily tasks with eternal significance, that makes every moment an opportunity for encounter with the living God. The invitation is universal, extended to everyone who has ever sensed that something was missing, that a gap existed between themselves and the holy, that all their efforts to bridge that gap by their own strength had ultimately failed. The altar in the wilderness was designed for exactly such people: broken people, guilty people, needy people, people who knew they could not save themselves and were willing to trust in something beyond their own resources. That design has not changed, even though the altar has. The heart that was open to the bronze altar is the same heart that remains open today, calling out to all who labour and are heavy laden, promising rest to all who will come. And so the story that began in the wilderness continues in hearts around the world. Hearts that have become altars, lives that have become offerings, worship that rises like smoke toward a heaven that is no longer distant but intimately near. The bronze altar served its purpose, pointing forward to a fulfillment it could never provide on its own. Now that fulfillment has come, and the altar's meaning lives on in everyone who approaches God through the one sacrifice that needs no repetition, the one lamb whose blood speaks eternal forgiveness, the one fire that purifies without consuming. The tabernacle is gone, the temple is gone, the bronze altar with its horns and its grating and its perpetual fire, all gone, dissolved into history, preserved only in memory and text. But the reality remains, the access remains, the mercy remains, and the fire, the holy fire that fell from heaven to ignite worship, that consumed offerings and revealed glory, that demanded reverence and offered grace, that fire still burns. It burns in the hearts of all who have received it. It burns in the worship of all who approach through Christ. It burns in the lives of all who have become living sacrifices, offering themselves daily on the altar of the heart. The bronze altar has done its work. Its teaching is complete. Its purpose is fulfilled. But the fire it kindled will never go out. It burns still, and it waits for you.